Here is a chunk of a SQL Loader control file, namely the part without the field definitions. What I want to look at here is column delimiters. We have two levels of column delimiting, namely as applying to the whole control file and as applying to individual fields. First of all, I'm looking at the part declared in the fields statement applying to all the rows in the entire input data file. The first thing you can do is you can state that each field is enclosed by a string and a string. So for instance, you could do, going back to my example file, you could simply say enclosed by and if you wanted to use two separate characters. Obviously with a single character, you would simply say enclosed by, and it would assume that both sides of a string are enclosed by that. So in this case, a string would actually look like this. This is a string, and it would be terminated by the question mark. And it helps if I spell that correctly. The second string would look like this, namely enclosed by double quotes as opposed to a double quote and a question mark. Going back to my example, column enclosure characters regardless of the length of the value. So whatever the length of that string is, the structure still recognizes that it's a single string. So this string will actually be this, and it will go into whatever field you specify for it, and this string will be the same field. If the length of this string defined in the field statement, which we'll get to later on, happens to be too small for this string, you'll actually get an error. If it's too large for either or both of these strings, then you either get spaces tabbed onto the end or a trimmed string going into the larger field definition string, depending on how you deal with white space, namely terminated by white space. What happens is that a field is detected as being terminated by white space when there are blank characters after it, tab characters, etc., and they are actually chopped off. And obviously you can determine the end of fields by an end of file marker as well. And there's an extension to this using a string enclosure set of characters as well. You can also preserve blank characters. In other words, when you're terminating a string by white space, if you have, for instance, this string. This is a string, and it has a bunch of spaces in here. Terminated by white space actually will result in those characters being chopped off. If you preserve blanks, then the string added to the field in the table will contain these blank characters on the end of it. This is what preserve blanks does. You can override the fields definition for the entire table by changing individual aspects for each column. In other words, this column will always be terminated by a comma character outside of the string specification. In other words, if you have this is, and then this is another string, this is the delimiter. If this character happens to be in the string, this will not delimit two columns unless you have something else determining how a string is enclosed. So, if you say enclosed by double quotes, and this was applied to these fields, and then you go and use question marks, obviously the control file will not recognize that this is actually a single continuous string denoted by the question marks. It will actually delimit the string based on this comma. So instead of 1, 2 fields here, you'll actually get 1, 2, 3.